That decline of 41,000 screens pre-COVID to 35,000 screens today, post-COVID, those 6,000 lost screens was overwhelmingly teeny tiny mom and pop theaters.
Renegade Online.
There's been a lot of discussion. We've had Alan Ng and the boys from Film Thread on here several times in the last few weeks. Hollywood's theatrical business is at risk of entering a negative feedback loop. Now, as you can see, this is from about 4 or 5 days ago. Not that old. This is from Deadline, from Dade Hayes. And the reason I brought this up, there was a lot of interesting things in this article. And this is what's going to get into my conversation here about Disney. That the Walt Disney Company is what has broken the theatrical industry. Because the theatrical industry, quite frankly, the reason that they accelerated as much as they did between 2009 and 2019 was because of the massive big budget, big marketing releases from the Walt Disney Company. You take those out of the equation, and the growth factor in theaters over those years was far more tepid than you'd imagine. I know Tom's talked about this as well, and he's been right on the money with it. But now, because of that dependency on the Walt Disney Company over the last 10 years, that now Disney, instead of cranking out winners, instead of cranking out audience pleasers, they're cranking out middle fingers to the audience. They're cranking out trash. They're cranking out poorly written, poorly made, poorly directed, poorly acted, poorly scored, whatever the hell you want to call it, movies, including things like Snow White. So here's the article from Deadline, Hollywood's theatrical business at risk of entering a negative feedback loop. Hollywood is at a risk of entering that with fewer wide movie releases and a shrinking theatrical footprint combining to squeeze box office revenue. In his annual assessment of the theatrical sector, billed as, quote, a memo to Hollywood, TD Cowen analyst Doug Kreutz notices that he has taken a, quote, bearish stance on the theatrical window for some time. Results from 2024, with total grosses slipping 4% from 23 to $8.75 billion. The number of wide releases down 6% from pre-COVID levels, and other factors have only reinforced his view. So here's the deal. That's not a huge number. 6% numbers of wide releases down. And again, those wide releases can include low-budget horror films, low-budget rom-coms, and everything else. When you actually look at the slate of Disney films in terms of their number in 2024 and 2025 compared to 2019, they're not terribly dissimilar. They're really not. Disney has been trying to ramp up the theatrical output. The difference, of course, in 2025 is that Disney is suffering from the issue of going hard left, hard political, hard DEI, and hard trash in filmmaking. From 2009 to 2019, Disney was cranking out crowd pleasers because most of those films were being built around commercial success. They were being built for the audiences that those film genres were meant for. Instead of saying, oh, we need to make Marvel for women all of a sudden. Now remember, during that time frame, that was including things like The Last Jedi, including things like The Rise of Palpatine in 2019. Basically all the Star Wars failures. Disney was still a huge hit. But again, Star Wars had already gone down the path of eschewing the audience that brought them to the dance. Marvel had not done that yet. Disney animation and Disney live action, like Aladdin live action, like Lion King live action, like Beauty and the Beast live action, those had not eschewed yet the audiences that brought them to the dance. We hadn't gotten yet to the days of The Little Mermaid and now Snow White. Quote, we've said for several years now that the outlook for a sustained recovery looks questionable, and that we don't think the existing global theatrical footprint can be supported solely by a handful of blockbusters. This is what Kreutz wrote in his 20-page report. The number of screens in the U.S. has declined to about 35,000 from 41,000 before COVID struck. Now, let me stop right there because I want to bring up an interesting point. I had this conversation in the last couple of weeks, and I think we did this on the air. Alan Ng was here from Film Threat, and we love Alan, and we love Chris. Mad respect for the guys at Film Threat. Alan brought up a point during the show when we were talking about theatrical revenue sharing back to distribution. And he said, well, it's about 60% domestic that goes back to theatrical. And I said, Alan, well, here's the thing. That may be true in some cases. But the problem is that when you look at the big boys, when you look at AMC theaters, they issue quarterly financial reports publicly because they're publicly traded companies. And those domestic revenues have pretty consistently been, for the last 10 years that I've gone back and researched all their financial reports, their average is about 52 to 53% domestic. Now, even if you give companies like Disney some deference to the fact that they consistently put out, or relatively consistently put out, some of the biggest blockbusters of the year, the math just has to math. That means that they're probably not paying Disney back more than 55%. Even in 2018 and 2019, the two biggest blockbuster years in theaters domestically, the average revenue paid back from AMC theaters, by far the largest chain in the country, and even has international exposure, was about 54%. So we kind of have a benchmark there. And I told Alan, I said, look, I totally believe you. I think you're right. I said, I think there are theaters out there that probably pay back closer to 60%, maybe in the first week or two, but they're all smaller chains. None of them are the big boys. And the issue is, going back to this article, the number of screens in the U.S. has declined from pre-COVID about 41,000 to 35,000. Rod, here's a great question for you, because you're a fellow economic nerd like myself. If you had to take a total stab in the dark, Rod, 6,000 screens have been lost since COVID. Would you think that the 6,000 screens that we lost since COVID are from big, massively financed, multi-billion-dollar companies like AMC, Regal, Cinemark, Cineplex, Marcus Theaters, or would you think maybe those 6,000 screens are probably the small mom and pop shops?
I mean, the way you pitched the question, it seems that you're telling me that, it seems the message is the big chain theaters are presumptively being cross-subsidized from other corporate revenues, and that the mom and pop theaters are the ones that are shutting down. That's what I would think. That's what I would think, knowing nothing else.
Exactly, right? I mean, it's kind of common sense. I mean, what happens in any time of economic recession? Who gets hit the hardest, Ron? Is it the big banks, the big businesses, or the hardest hit or the most business closures on the smaller and mid-size areas?
Well, let's put it this way. When you advise your clients in financial planning to diversify, you're telling them to do something that outside the world of investing can only be done by very big companies. So that if movies are slowing down, well, you've got streaming. If streaming slows down, well, you've got licensing. If licensing slows down, you've got theme parks. Whereas mom and pop, who put their entire life into a couple of theaters, they're not typically not diversified.
The other big thing that corporations have is like AMC, when they did in the middle of COVID, when they did a huge restructuring of their debt, which we covered on this channel, did the restructuring of the debt, and they were then able to, through that restructuring, and their attorneys were able to simultaneously get two things done. They restructured their debt and got more at the same time. And I'm not talking
Mike, why do you remember why they were able to do that?
Yeah, because what they did is they changed the valuation on all the real estate and pulled it out of the operating company.
So what was unique to AMC is that AMC also, unlike everybody else out there, unlike all their competitors, they got meme stocked on Reddit.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we covered
and they blew I mean, they went from $5 a share to $70 a share virtually overnight. And AMC was able to dump a bunch of treasury shares at a premium.
Okay, so the short answer is access to the public markets.
Yep.
Boom.
Access to public markets, which means all the scamming that comes along with being a publicly held company.
Yep.
They were able to raise a metric poop ton of capital in a very short period of time. And to your point, Mike, which was all correct, the restructuring of debt and all that was made available and possible by the fact that they got meme stocked and they suddenly were able to raise a ton of capital to go ahead and pay down the debt and restructure a lot of stuff. Here's the thing. None of the other top 5 theatrical chains out there were able to do that. And Ron, to your point, back to this, who was the least able to do anything? Could mom and pop theaters restructure debt in the midst of crushing customer loss?
Restructured debt for mom and pop means using your credit card line of credit, which is not a good strategy.
Right. So the reason why we took the long road around this is to really try to educate the chat out there. This is what we do here. That decline of 41,000 screens pre-COVID to 35,000 screens today, post-COVID, those 6,000 lost screens was overwhelmingly teeny tiny mom and pop theaters. And it's those theaters, to my conversation with Alan Ng and Film Threat, those are the theaters that were probably paying outsized rentals back to companies like Disney. And as the spectrum shrinks, as we get more and more tightly compressed big players out in the market, those theatrical revenue shares will continue to go down. Go ahead, Ron.
I was talking about in my beginning of my answer, cross-subsidization, right? Yep. You just raised a much more subtle version of cross-subsidization, which is not only can you keep certain lines of business open by using funds from other lines of business, you've got all kinds of other economic advantages that come from having other lines of business, as well as other mouths to feed. But the point is, it is access to capital and access to credit as strategic, and we're not even talking about the vertical integration components, right? I mean, to a large extent, that's not what, in the 40s, a Paramount theater played Paramount Pictures, and so on and so on, and that was just too good for the antitrust laws to allow it to continue.
I was going to say the government regulated that out of existence, and then it recently expired in the last couple of years.
Right.
This is the point, is that the averages are gravitating more towards the big players in the game. And let me make this clear. For those of you out there who may be financial aficionados or historical aficionados, I had this same conversation with clients 17 years ago now, after the financial crisis in 2008. I said, look, here's what's going to happen, right? The government pulled the rug out from beneath its own farce, which was their subprime mortgage lending scandal. I'm not going to go back down there. I've explained it on this show many times, and I can tell you that was absolutely, as somebody who was deeply involved in the financial and banking industry at the time, that was absolutely something that was totally government engineered bullshit. The government got in bed. What did they do at that point? They got in bed with the big players. They got in bed with Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan Chase. They got in bed with Wells Fargo, with Goldman Sachs. They got in bed with Capital One Bank, Bank of America, blah, 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 blah. And guess who wrote the Dodd-Frank bill that was supposed to fix everything? It was all the big players. The big banks basically helped the lawyers in Congress write the legislation in such a way that the mid and small-sized players would never be able to play the game again because they couldn't afford to. They were going to make the regulations so absurd that the level of compliance that they had to deal with was untenable, financially untenable, to where all of these mid and small-sized banks, these regional and local banks, would be forced to sell up the chain. And let me tell you, I witnessed, even in my own little New Orleans area, at least a dozen of these things happening because I worked with these bankers a lot of the times. We had some degree of partnership or whatever else we were. I watched this happen right after 2008. From 2009 to 2012, 2015, it was a dumpster fire of small banks selling off. I'm not trying to say that this is happening with some federal regulation. In the theatrical industry, it's not. But here's the point. It doesn't have to. The natural law of economics, the natural order of effect, when you have a nationwide shutdown of the entire economy, guess what's going to happen? The small guys are going to get crushed, and they've been pushed out. So therefore, what's left in the industry here, okay, is that what you have to understand, and I'll pull this one up as well. This is this report, the state of the cinema industry. What I want everybody to understand out there, we just said 35,000 screens in the U.S. are what remains. What you need to understand is that the top 5 largest theatrical exhibitioners in the country represent nearly 60% of those remaining screens. 5 players: AMC, Regal, Cinemark, Cineplex, Marcus Theaters. They represent roughly 60%, 20,000 almost, of those remaining 35,000 screens. And they are paying back these distribution channels roughly 55% on average. My best, very well educated and researched guess, I'm saying 55% to the biggest theatrical releases. Again, if those releases come out and they go back in the till to streaming within 17 days or 30 days, it's probably going to be lower. But 55% is where we are based on AMC and Cinemark's public releases of data. So this is why I've been harking around this. But here's the thing. For all the reasons that Disney has been surging the theatrical window in the last 7 to 10 years, it's now dead because of Disney. And the reason is because Disney is actually just releasing trash. Disney has gone from releasing quality films that drove audiences into the screens. The very company that created the bellwether, the largesse, the windfall profits, if you were, for theaters between, say, 2009 and 2019, the very same company now is killing them. And the reason is because when you put out a bunch of bad movies, people just stop showing up, with rare exception. Yes, you'll still get the horror crowd showing up out there, but you're not going to get the general audiences anymore. And movies like Snow White, movies like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny and Strange World and everything else, this is where we are. Disney is not saving the theatrical industry by putting out 6 to 7 big blockbuster budgeted movies a year. They're murdering it because they're trash. Yeah, they might wind up at the end of this year once again having the biggest theatrical share that's out there. But what's going to happen the next year and the year after? What's happening to the overall audience? Ron?
We don't have a state of monopoly, but we do have an oligopoly. Obviously, very few players. That's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Monopolies, under economic theory, don't seek to maximize marginal profit the way regular businesses do. They seek to maximize output because there's so little consumer resistance to their pricing. All they have to do is throw as much out there, and the revenue will reflect the volume. The problem is no markets are that simple anymore. They are, in fact, acting like a monopoly. Mm-hmm. They're acting like a monopoly. But they're not a monopoly because there's competition. Even though much of the competition, and look what's happening to Warner. I mean, for God's sake, much of the competition is falling on its face, stepping on rakes itself. But also there are all these other alternatives, what we call in economics substitutes, all these other substitutes. So of course, it's rational for Disney to do exactly what it's doing, which is to try to also grab the substitutes. Then you have the problem, though, of if your company culture is still to act like a monopoly, instead of moving into those substitutes with niches that correspond to what makes sense in those new lines of business, you're still just crapping out stuff like Disney, Disney too. They're like a shark that has to keep swimming. They have to just keep putting stuff out.
Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.